It was very clear to us at the time that now, we can no longer kind of have our feet in two boats. In hindsight, we probably took longer to come to the final decision than we should have. Like, I think we had enough evidence to do this, to pull the plug even in the middle of 2017.
Hello and welcome to Legendary Pivots. My name is Aditi and I'm the co-founder of ARC. We are a news media publication that writes on high-growth tech companies based out of India. The Indian startup ecosystem has produced some of the most disruptive companies over the last few years. We have seen these companies take a full circle from seed to IPO. All of these businesses may have initially looked like their global counterparts, but what made them truly successful was their ability to come up with India-centric solutions. What has not been appreciated enough is how these companies transitioned from the initial idea of what they were passionate about to taking the business to a product market fit and eventual scale up.
At the time, our thesis was that a tech-enabled services marketplace, which does some quality control, some curation of the supply side, but largely is tech-driven and does not get its hands dirty in the service delivery, should be a very scalable and winning model. That's at least the assumption with which we started. The category got very heated up very quickly. And by the end of 2015, most of us in the category had the same model, which was sort of this tech-enabled marketplace model. As a founding team, we were beginning to realize that the model that we are scaling does not have product market fit. And there were two reasons for this. One was the customer cohorts were not smiling up or even retaining well. And there was a lot of pressure on us to onboard new suppliers because there's a fair amount of supply churn as well. So somewhere at the back of our minds, we realized that, hey, this model that we've started with, it's actually probably not like the real winnable model. The challenge, of course, was that the popular wisdom at the time was that it was a good model. We had raised 3 rounds of institutional capital on the back of that model. Other competitors were also pretty much doing the same thing. I think that's when we had to sort of take a hard look at, who we are and why we decided to start this company in the first place. And I remember in one of the leadership sessions that we had, we said that, look, finally we have to solve for the customer. This model doesn't work for the customer. So let's put the customer front and center of our decision making and let's see what happens. We picked up the one service that we thought was most important and relevant at the time for our core customers, which was beauty services for women at home. We were building a platform essentially for the busy woman, the busy mothers, and of course others were also using it, but the core TG was that. And if we could send the salon to her house, we felt that could be a good value prop vis-a-vis they having to step out. The good thing we did was we said that, okay, if we are going down the track of building this category, we will do the full 9 yards. We will recruit the right service professionals, we will train them, we will give them uniforms, kits, everything, right? And we will manage the entire supply chain, the entire backend of this, and let's see what happens. So we started the model really small in Delhi, Gurgaon, and I remember the first batch of about 25, 30 beauticians got trained in one of our VP's homes in the basement, and we launched. And then in about 6 to 9 months, something very interesting happened. Beauty was the only category where we had smiling cohorts on the consumer side. Every other category would depleting cohorts.
So you had beauty on the marketplace as well and
Yes.
beauty like this, so you were able to compare the
Yes,
two? Was that
we in a few cities continued beauty under the marketplace model. And then, of course, all the other categories were under the marketplace
Right.
model. But in Gurgaon to start with, and then perhaps Bangalore and Mumbai, we pivoted beauty to the full stack model.
Okay.
So in these cities for beauty, the cohorts were smiling up. The customer retention was beautiful. We started seeing organically service professionals show up at our offices saying, I've heard that on this platform I can make 40, 50,000 rupees a month. I would also like to join. My friend has joined. So organic supply side, reach out. This was the first time we were seeing it, because otherwise we were doing sales calling
Right.
to onboard service professionals. And in WhatsApp groups of societies and customers, we started to be known as a beauty app. So people started saying, "Oh, there's a beauty app called Urban Club. You can download that." And initially, it was a bit unnerving. I was like, we are doing so many things. We are not a beauty app. But then I realized that this is the direction of travel for the customer. This is the only category where we're actually fully solving the need for the customer. Um, so we then decided in 2017 that let us take a hard stab at not just moving beauty, but as many other categories as we can to this new model. And all of 2017 went into moving categories like cleaning, AC and appliance repair, electricians, plumbers, carpenters. Um, and we even tried a couple of other categories which we couldn't succeed in, like packers and movers, etc. So we were trying to pivot a bunch of categories to this model. Seems easy, but each category has its own nuance of training, operational intensification, supply side density creation, changing the supply, like aligning the suppliers to the new model, its own, product supply chain that you have to build. So it took a while. It took like pretty much all of 2017. And we continue to operate the remaining 95 odd services in the open marketplace model, where we were basically connecting the dots, but not really, closing the loop and not really taking responsibility. That was a mistake. I feel like we should have shut everything down in 2017 and only focused on these 5, 6 categories, but we didn't know better at the time. So, end of 2017, we reached a very unique place where we had one half of the business, which includes, your beauty, cleaning, handyman, appliance repair, all of which had pivoted to the full stack model and was growing fast, but was only at the time generating about half the revenues through these 4, 5 categories. And then the remaining 95 categories under the open marketplace model had also scaled up, and they were generating the 50% of the revenue. So we had like 50-50 revenue coming from these two businesses. This is end of 2017, and it was very clear to us at the time that now we can no longer kind of have our feet in two boats. We have to pick, because it's just getting harder and harder. And there were almost two orgs inside the company with their own cultures now. And so, we picked the full stack marketplace. In Jan, we had a board meeting, and I told the board that, it's time to it's time to draw the curtains on this open marketplace model, and we will pivot to the full stack model.
So, Aditi, you've been covering Urban Company for a long time, back 10 years ago when they were called Urban Clap. So, in this case study, what were you able to discover which stood out to you or which was something new?
So, what really stood out for me was the fact that, in 2018, half of their revenue was coming from this managed marketplace where they had yoga instructors and they had photographers, wedding photographers. And half of their business was coming from the home category of beauty, plumbing, and where they would manage the end to end marketplace. The decision to say that I'm going to get rid of half of my revenue, which is photography and the yoga business, was huge at that point in time, because every startup was vying for high growth, high revenue, big market size. And here is a company that fought with like hundreds of competitors and came on top, raised 55 million, raised on the back of a story of having they wanted to digitize every service in the country, to now saying I'm going to cut it down to only two services, beauty and home. This decision to be able to do that at that stage of the company was something that really stood out. Running two orgs at the same time, and this would have scaled gradually to a 50% number, and
Yes.
the other side would be coming down. How
The
was
other
it?
side was also growing, unfortunately.
Oh, that other side was also.
So
That's even tougher.
That's even tougher.
So, what was that process like for you and Varun, everybody in the team?
See, I think, to be honest, in hindsight, we probably took longer to come to the final decision than we should have. Like, I think we had enough evidence to do this, to pull the plug even in the middle of 2017. That's probably the earliest we could have done it. So we probably took 6 to 8 months longer to get to the decision. because it's hard to let go of revenue, especially when you're a funded
Right.
company, and it's hard to kind of go from 100 to 50 overnight.
Right.
But I think outside of that, like it was very clear to us. Like the evidence, the data was there, the evidence was there in terms of supply and customer cohorts. The gut was there. We were using the platform ourselves, so we knew where the experience was good,
Right.
where it was not. Our friends were only using us for these 4-5 things. Once in a while, I would tell the friend that, wedding photographer, because my friends were getting married. Why don't you hire a wedding photographer from urban company? And they're like, honestly, I found somebody else. So there's a lot of evidence. It was very clear to us that that this was the direction of travel, and this is what we needed to do. I think it finally boiled down to kind of, as with most things, you have to move with conviction. And I think it was, I think we were negotiating with ourselves for a while, to be honest, for a few months, that, how do we let go of 50% revenues? Can some of it be salvaged? Can some of it be pivoted? And finally, me and the two other founders, we got to a point where we said, okay, this is it. Like, there's nothing of salvage value here. Even if it's 50% of the revenue, it's not going to be 50% of the revenue in the future. So we just have to let go.
And I really like the opening anecdote of the case study that you put together, where he just talks to his board about getting rid of half of the revenues. So, what is your takeaway after hearing that story?
I think what was interesting was Abhiraj and Varun and Raghav as co-founders are such that I think they'd already made up their mind before they came in. And like, how Abhinav from Axel pointed out that the best kind of pivots come from founders who know what they're doing and they're not looking at the board for solutioning with them, but rather for their support in because they have gone through the nitty gritties of every aspect of the business. And that really stood out. So I remember Abhiraj saying that 50% of their business was to be wiped out overnight. But he also thought that he took longer to get to that decision. So what was I think January 2018, in Abhiraj's head, he would have probably done it 6 months earlier. And he took those 6 months to build his conviction and go to the board. So I think he was fairly well prepared. What was interesting was that despite having new investors on board, everybody gave them the room to work through this pivot and gave them the chance to work on the pivot. And you had raised about 50 million at the time when you had finally taken the call?
Around 37.
Okay. What was that discussion like with the board? Were they tracking this for a while, and was this like a point of discussion throughout the board meetings? Or
No, I think to the board, it wasn't like it was, like we had. I think they knew that there are these two businesses, but and maybe we did a little bit of seeding, but there was a board meeting where we brought it up in a very
which was in
meaningful way,
January?
which was in January,
Okay.
and we said that this is what we're going to do. There was a brief discussion on what do we do with the, you know, open marketplace business. Can we spin it off? Can we sell it to someone? And we said, no, there's nothing we can do about it. We'll have to let go. I think it was a pretty quick call.
And why didn't you decide to sell it or salvage it in some
There
other
was
way?
no salvage value, in my view.
Okay.
I think the board, we had a small board that time. We had 3 people: Ravi Adusumali from Elevation, Vishal from Bessemer, Abhinav Chaturvedi from Axel, and Vamsi was a board observer from VY. Four of them, 3 of us. It was quick.
Okay.
They were aligned.
And what were the competitive dynamics at the time when this switch was like going on in full swing?
I think a few players were still around. I think most had perished.
Right.
I think a few players were still around, but they were also subscale. So that was, honestly helpful. That the peak of the competitive intensity was behind us,
Right.
and we could sort of do the right thing for the customer. But surprisingly, none of the competitors had, in a full-fledged manner, shifted to this model yet. They were trying in their own way, and some of them had mimicked what we were trying to do through the last 1.5 years. But none of them had really fully embraced it, and that helped us, I think, because they had not done that. they were still subscale, and we were fairly large at the time vis-a-vis them. Not of
Alright.
course large in absolute terms, but relative to them, we had grown
Alright.
quite a bit.
And once you decided to do the pivot, what was it like to convey it to the teams? Did you have to reorg the team at all? What was the process internally?
We had to reorg the team because we had to absorb the talent that we had in the open marketplace model, and we had fairly good talent there as well into the core full stack model. Thankfully, the full stack model was growing very rapidly. It was growing, 200-300% year on year at the time. So there was enough and more, to be done, and we could absorb almost all of them. It was very, very quick decision. I mean, the decision took time, but once
Right.
taken, it was very quick. There was no long process or democracy or consensus building. The founders were aligned. We aligned very quickly our leadership team, and then we announced it to the company.
How did your leadership team change in that process?
I think over the next 1.5 years, the entire leadership team changed.
Okay.
Yeah. I think later that year we had Mukund join us, who's our chief business officer now.
Which is also what I wanted to ask. How
Yeah.
did you end up with that decision that you needed somebody that seasoned in the journey to build a business?
I think once we started scaling the full stack model, I realized that the operational intensity and the scale that this model could reach and what it requires, like we didn't have the talent pool within the company to be able to do justice to that. We could learn, and we had great talent that could learn and that could kind of learn on the job, but we would have lost time, and we had already lost time, to be honest, because
Right.
of this whole pivot. And even the founders, in my view, we were also learning on the job. So I, now that the model was clear to me and it was very clear what needed to be done, I didn't want to waste more time. So I wanted the resources inside the company that could scale and super scale the model. And Mukund and a few other people joined at the time who were basically super scalers. And that's what they did. They had to learn newer challenges that kept coming along the way. But I think there were 3-4 folks who had joined at the time who definitely kind of took the company to the next level.
And right when this was happening, what were some of the things that changed as you scaled up? Like, what were some of the processes that changed as you scaled up? That is one question.
So we started doing this in early 2018. Everything changed, to be honest. Like the entire company's process, the way of doing things, everything changed because between 2018 when we took this call and this business was 50% and the other business was 50, so we let go of that. So now let's say the scale is 50. But when we exited 2018, this scale was now 200.
Okay.
So anyways, year-on-year growth was 100%, but in reality, the underlying business had grown, 4x.
Right.
And then the next year it grew another 3x. So, it kind of, we went from like 100 to 600.
Right.
Right. While letting go of half the business. So the underlying business scaled 12x almost. So the business has scaled rapidly in the 2-year span. And as a result, the internal processes, the technology, the operational intensity, everything changed, right? The headcount of the company grew quite a bit. But thankfully, the cultural ethos of the company, that remained intact because we had enough people who had seen the company in the first 3 years also
Right.
continue with the company. And the new talent that we brought in were also culturally aligned to the way we were, which is sort of, frugal, long-term thinkers, missionary, and just humble people, down to earth, getting the job done. So I think we were able to amalgamate the new talent very well with the existing talent and sort of scale the company without losing the cultural ethos, because pivots can also end up
Right.
I mean, you have to let go of you have to shed some
Right.
dead weight, but you want to retain the good part of the culture because that's what makes you the company that you are. That's what makes you the company that could take that call to make that
Right.
pivot, right?
So Aditi, I've been going through the case study, and obviously Urban Company listed last year, but
Yeah.
I think the case study goes into fairly early to mid aspects of his 10 to 15 year journey right now. So, what was the most interesting part for the case study for you, and why did you pick one company?
So I think when Urban Company started, they were not alone. There were about 100 such companies that were founded around the same time. But in terms of execution, they were always the ones that were standing out. And they were also the most iterative. So they had done multiple things within the services space, and ultimately raised about $55 million. And when that round happened, I think it was very clear that this is one startup winner take all market, and everybody else shut down. So, what really stood out was the fact that they were able to fight it out in the early days, know exactly when to raise money, and know exactly when to narrow down their business to the two aspects that really they wanted to focus on, which was home and beauty. I just want to go back to one aspect that you mentioned, that you had tried to do multiple models for full stack, and beauty and personal care and home are the two that you
Yeah.
sort of scaled at the end. What were the others that you tried, and what were the other learnings in terms of which models work and which don't work
Yeah.
in?
We tried packers and movers.
Okay.
Very, very, uh, I think, strong attempt at it for about a year. Eventually, we concluded that it's a logistics business, not a home services business.
Right.
And we were struggling not so much with the packing part of it, but more with the moving part of it.
Okay.
Because we weren't a logistics company.
Right.
And we had eventually got to the point where the team said that to do this really well, we need our own trucks.
Okay.
And I said, that's where I draw the line at full
Yeah.
stack. I'm not owning any trucks. So I can do full stack for anything inside your home. And it was a very defining period because we realized that, okay, as a company, who are we? We are, we are a home platform. We are a home services company. So anything inside your home is fair game for us. But if it's outside your home, there are aspects of it we don't understand, and we don't want to get involved in that right now. Like one of the other questions I've been asked is, why don't you get into, physical retail for beauty? And it's just a different business. It has a whole different set of complications, logistics. We have so much to do here in the full stack business. So that was sort of, very clearly to us, it became very clear that, okay, this part, is not some, I mean, it can be done. Nothing is impossible, but, not at this stage for our company. The reason why we continue to keep trying, to get painting right now, painting is a different service from a lot of other services that we offer, because every other service is one person going, delivering the service in a matter of 2 to 3 hours and coming back. That's it.
Right.
That model, I think we had nailed. Painting is a multi-day, multi-people service. And it was much harder for us to finally get the hang of painting and learn how to do that. And now, of course, we don't just do painting, we do texture paints, we do wall paneling. Like, we've learned so much over the years. But initially it was a challenge. But uh, we remained at it because we said that this is inside the home. So we have to crack it. We can't not crack it. So yeah.
Understood. And in terms of, so painting is something that you.
Then we tried others as well, like tutors at home
Okay.
and yoga trainers at home. But we realized that it's very hard to standardize that. The needs of the customers and needs of the type of service professionals are too many. So we couldn't standardize that. There was a lot of disintermediation. So we let went of that. And then there were other services which fundamentally cannot be standardized, like a wedding photographer or an interior designer, and so on and so forth, where the customer itself starts from the point of view that, look, I want my home or my wedding to be unlike anybody else's, absolutely unique.
Yeah.
So, you can't standardize when the customer need is one for uniqueness.
Got it. How were the orgs for each of these categories different? How did the org shape up before and after?
Yes. So what we realized that earlier we just used to have one org for the marketplace business and one org for the full stack business. But when we pivoted and when Mukund joined, so he said, we can't have just one org doing everything. I said, why not? He said, we won't scale. So we'll need to have separate orgs for everything. And I said, what about city general managers, because we used to have one general manager running the whole city. He said, we'll have separate general managers for every vertical. I said, what about training? Because we used to have one training center for everything. He said, we'll have separate training centers for everything. And then I'm like, okay, but who's going to pay for all of this? So he said, we'll work out the unit economics, and if it works, we'll prove it that it can work. And I realized, okay, this makes sense. Like, frugality doesn't mean that you don't set up the business for, compounding and growth. This is what is needed to grow and compound. And as long as each of those verticals, in our view, can make money in the long run and the unit economics is strong, that's the right thing to do. So then we actually, for a while, and that's when the headcount which I mentioned burgeoned like in a year's time, because we had to basically set up for very brief period of time we discussed some matrix structure that a city GM will be common, etc., etc. And I think Mukund pretty much threw all of that out of the window after he joined, and he said that everything will, like, we will not come in the way of growth. Every vertical will have everything it needs to super scale, and verticals will be sort of fully empowered with their own training org, their own city operationals org, their own supply onboarding org, etc. There is, no synergies we need at this stage. At scale, if we feel some of the things can be platformized and synergized, that's fine. One thing we didn't do, and that was a great decision, was tech was never built for verticals. Tech was always built as a common, scalable platform across verticals. And that was, I think, an immensely amazing decision we took. And hard fought at the time by Raghav, my co-founder, and Kanav, and the team, but the right call. And that has meant that the strength of our tech platforms, um, and the fact that tech has actually over time been able to solve business problems fundamentally, and the teaming they have with their business counterparts is incredible. Otherwise, it can easily go down the track of tech teams being servitude in some sense to business teams, and just building what the business teams want for each vertical, because each vertical has its own tech. And we decided very, very early that we don't want to do that. There'll be some compromise on last mile customization, etc., but it's worth it, and it was.
Also, talk to me a little bit about the disintermediation, which is like a big aspect of, the perception of a services business that, it's very easy to do. It's very easy to, just bypass the platform in the middle. How did you, and I think this is a mix of both ops as well as tech that, you have incorporated within the company, but run us through your view on how you dealt with this.
Yeah. See, I've seen this play out now over 11 years. So the simple answer is that the more value you add as a platform, the less the disintermediation becomes. And we've seen this through data, through customer retention, through supply side retention. So our first model, the marketplace model, was highest prone to disintermediation. As we've pivoted to the full stack model and continue to add more value, and even within the full stack model, our value addition and our depth of supply side integration has only increased over the last 5-6 years. In fact, now when we look back at our full stack model of 2019, we don't even think it was a full stack model. We look back and almost laugh within the company that, oh, we were calling that full stack, but it wasn't really full stack, right? The kind of utilization we're able to drive, the kind of earnings we're able to drive for service professionals, the kind of value add we're able to do to them and to the customer has dramatically increased. For example, I'll give you an example. Full stack in 2019 for appliance care and AC for us was that somebody comes at the time that you've chosen, repairs, gives you a bill, and goes back. Today we are imagining full stack, which is UC branded spares, a diagnostic tool that identifies second opinion, AI based Veritas tool that identifies any issues that have gone on, 3 to 6 month warranty. So it's a totally different ecosystem that we have created, and that has meant the value add for both sides has increased, and consequently the disintermediation has kept shrinking. It'll never go to zero, but it's, you have to see the linear curve, and here it's to us it's been very clear.
And in beauty, I'm assuming it was the products that.
It was the products, it was the safety elements that we had built for both sides, particularly our women partners. It was the whole training and also the career progression. in beauty, because you didn't just start off as one professional. If you started in classic, you could progress to prime and then Lux. Earnings for Lux partners were 2 to 3x higher than earnings for classic partners. So professionals could see that if they stay on the platform and they compound their reputation, they have a clear career path. They were seeing now a lot of their trainers were coming from the service fleet itself, and they'd gone through the whole career ladder and then become full-time trainers on the platform. So that aspiration value increased. We were offering free life, accidental, and health insurance. That became a strong draw to stay on the platform. We were giving personal loans, home loans, vehicle loans. So there was a lot of enablement that was happening, which meant that people started to say that it's better for me to just stick to the platform and go through it, and I will earn well, and I will also progress in my career, versus trying to play circumspect and trying to kind of build a side business, etc.
Okay.
And these categories help them how? How did the business scale up after?
So when they decided to get into these categories, another thing that stood out was that the business actually completely changed. So for us as consumers, we think of it as, okay, we are seeing two categories now instead of five. But at the back end, something very interesting was happening in the org. So they never, for example, had training centers. It was a company that was purely tech based and, based on the aggregation model with a certain level of control. Now they were opening training centers. They had zones in Bangalore, Delhi, Bombay, and they were thinking about what materials to use, what products to use, how to onboard people, and how to go about standardizing these services. Having a standardized rate card, making sure that there is no disintermediation happening in the value chain. All those aspects were very new and very operationally intensive. I think when the company started, the idea was more to be a tech platform and to be an enabler and to be quote unquote a sharper just dial. And now what they were looking at is something where you had to go into the trenches, learn everything 0 to 1, do the training, um, and make sure that these services have standardized outcomes for consumers, which is probably the hardest part of consumer internet. Looking back, what was the toughest part of making this journey, the pivot work? Was it aligning investors? Was it your internal validation that this would work? Was it the teams? What was the toughest part of making this happen?
I think the toughest part is to get to the decision itself. Once you've taken the decision, the rest of it is easy actually, because then you know what you're doing, right? And then you have mental clarity, and if it works, it works. It doesn't work, it doesn't work. And not every shot we take at the goal post will go into the goal. But the toughest part is to actually convince yourself that this is the right thing to do, and going ahead with it, because everybody else is really going to rely on the founder's conviction.
And were three of you were you like getting convinced at this? Were you getting conviction at the same pace? Was somebody ahead of?
I think the three of us on some of these big decisions have been surprisingly very aligned. We do, argue and fight with each other for the minor stuff,
Nitpicking on the.
but for the big calls, I think we're pretty aligned. Like, it's haven't necessarily deviated. Um, I do think this was a case where the other two founders were probably there on the decision sooner than I was as well. And there were like a few other people in the company as well who were already there sooner than
Is
I
it because
was.
they were seeing some signs that you were at a macro level not?
I was, probably holding on to the marketplace business for a lot longer than I should have, given that, I felt that, oh, we had raised institutional capital and how will it look if the revenue falls, et cetera, et cetera. And, they were probably approaching it from a much more first principles led conviction, which said that it's the right thing for the customer, so we should do it. In fact, I remember when I'd announced it, like right after the announcement, I think one of my colleagues came up to me, not the two founders because I'd already discussed and thrashed it out with them, but one of my colleagues came up to me and said that, Abhiraj, what took you so long? Like, you should have done this 6 months back. And that was a moment for me to realize, okay, uh, you know, history might judge this as a bold, defining, solid pivot, but in reality, like it's probably
Right.
the writing was on the wall, and I could have even done it sooner.
And did you have a backup plan if somebody doesn't agree with you on the board, that
No,
you just knew that this is what needs to be done?
I don't think I've thought so much. Like I should have had a
Yeah.
backup plan in
You
case
didn't
somebody
have
said.
that.
But at the time, I thought that it's fairly straightforward that we have to do this, and the board should agree. And also, backup plans, etc., you create when you expect pushback, from someone in the board. I think we knew that the board will intellectually grill us. They'll ask us questions, but if we are able to answer them, then they are not. They're very straightforward, and we've shared vision for the company. So uh, our board, one of the things I've was very proud of, all my investors, and to be honest, is they were always long term. If it's the right thing long term for the business, that's fine. Do not worry about the short term. Take the hard calls and run towards the hard problems as long as it's the right thing for the long term. And it's shaped the DNA of the company. Uh, we don't shy away from the hard things.
And any mentors along the way that you spoke to?
I think Kunal and Rohit from Titan,
Okay.
definitely, and they also founders themselves in
Right.
Snapdeal. I used to spend a lot of time with them at the time, and they did sort of say that this is the right call, and you should do it. They were super supportive, and then we had uh, a couple of other angels also who were very helpful. So yeah, definitely. Irina Vittel had just started working with us, not on the board but as an advisor, um, and she would not even pay any attention to this whole marketplace business. She would only talk about like the full stack business. So that was also a sign
Okay.
that I mean, she, I think in her mind had already concluded that this
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 is
one
not
they
going to.
anyways
Yeah.
shut down. So yeah, uh,
As a founder, was there anything that you had to unlearn to embrace this process of a pivot? This is for other founders who are probably in the same phase, maybe somewhere thinking that, give it 6 more months in that time frame. Is there, what would be your advice to them?
I think as founders, like we have to continue to be decisive and lead with conviction when the decision and the evidence is clear to us, right? I think we cannot be brash, we cannot be cavalier, but if the evidence is clear and it's very clear to us that it's the right thing for the customer, then I think we shouldn't hold back. And I have seen founders, in fact, last week I was talking to a founder who was uh, presenting a case for a pivot to me. And I told him that there could not be, greater evidence in favor of a pivot in what you're doing compared to any other thing that I've seen. So, you have significantly more evidence than even I had.
So you're late. Does that also mean that you're late if you have significantly more evidence?
In his case, I don't think so because he had accidentally, while doing a bunch of things, chanced upon this this new vertical of his, and it has taken off in the last 4 5 months. And the whole business is about 4 5 years old, and the first 4 5 years they had no traction at all. But in the last 4 5 months, they have a lot of traction because of this
Right.
new vertical. But there's a team and there's a legacy of the last 5 years, and the team feels that all the other products we have can be cross-sold and so on and so forth. I
Right.
said, you have nothing to protect, and that's the thing. I think sometimes we get tied up with whatever we've built so far, and we have to realize that anyways it's very small. Like even at this scale of UC, like whatever has been created is like very small in the scheme of things. So I can't get tied up to sort of what we have done, right? Like we have to, like this year, we have significantly prioritized building InstaHealth and moving our entire business to, uh, sort of fast track service delivery. And we've announced this publicly and through our shareholder letters and on the earnings calls. And it's an operationally complex transition. But we are fully committed to it and we're doing it, and it's the right thing in the long term. So the short term pain is worth it.
That brings me to my last question, Abhiraj. If you were starting urban company today, what would you do differently?
I would not start it. It's too hard. There are easier ways to make money. But jokes aside, I think I would definitely start with the full stack model. Uh, and I would definitely start with sort of speed being prioritized from day one. Um, I think those two things would be table stakes. Apart from that, not too much else differently. Uh, but yeah, I would not go through the long meandering 3-year journey of finally committing to the full stack model. And I think speed is, it's something that with quick commerce, anyways, in the last 1 or 2 years has become a reality. So we wouldn't have had the scale and the density also to pull it off back in 2019, 2020, and the time was also not right. So some things are also a function of, why now and is it the right time? And I think we prioritize speed in 2025, end of 24, we had a offsite, and that's when we decided as a team that we'll do it. And we'd been doing it like in pockets and pilots for the last 6 months, the second half of 2024. So we had the evidence that it works.
Is that also for all categories or are there specific categories?
No, everything. We are committed to, like, of course, maybe like a wall paneling. Also, we want to do fast and but not like in 10 minutes, but 24 hours. You can get a whole wall transformed in 24 hours. That's where we wanted to get to. But everything else, like, we would like it to be available as soon as possible for you, whether it's a massage, a haircut, a plumber, carpenter, electrician, bathroom cleaning service, quick fix of your AC, the Insta help, housekeeping service, Insta cook at some stage, which we'll scale up. Yeah, all of this we'd like it to be available at the tap of a button as quickly as possible.
Understood. Thank you so much. This is very helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you for spending time with us.
Thank you, Aditi. Thank you for having me.